Sure, you could probably buy a cheap witch hat at, I don't know, Walmart or Spirit Halloween. One size fits all. Or you could make your very own with a pattern. Oh, well, it's also one size fits all. But if you're anything like me, you want your witch hat to be special, crafted with attention and care, not some cheap one-size-fits-all thing. After all, it's called witchcraft, not witch, just go buy something because it's easier. Craft. So come along with me and I'll share with you the sacred knowledge passed down through the generations that you will need to craft your own witch hat in any size you can conceive, whether that's doll size, child size, adult size, or dog size. Hey, who said familiars have to be cats? So, let the magic begin. But first we'll need to consult my book of sketchbook. Yes, this perfectly ordinary sketchbook. Reveal your secrets to me. The pattern for a witch hat is actually fairly simple. The pattern piece for the cone is just a circular sector, or basically a large pizza-looking thing. And the brim piece is basically a donut. Drafting these pieces is not too complicated. But first we need 3 pieces of information. 1. The desired circumference of your hat or head. This is the circumference of your head plus ease. In my case, this was about 22.5 inches. At this point, we aren't talking about the seam allowance. We'll do that later. Ease is just the amount of room we are leaving for comfort or hairstyle. 2. You need to decide how tall you want your crown to be. I decided to go with 10 inches, which I thought was about right. Witchy without being too comical, I think. 3. You need to know how wide you would like your brim to be. I love big hats, so I went with about 4 inches. Now that we've got our measurements, we just need to do a little math. Don't panic, it's just 3 simple formulas, and you will be so proud of yourself when you're finished, I promise. Witches, by the way, are big on math, because nothing is so empowering as knowledge. So that's one thing the movies often get wrong. You can think of a cone kind of like a right triangle being spun around 360 degrees, or like an isosceles triangle rotating on its axis of symmetry, H, as you can see in my diagram. The base of the cone, as you can see, is a circle. To draft a brim piece that is correctly sized for the cone, we need to find the radius of this circle. We can find that by using the formula for the circumference of a circle, which of course is C equals 2 pi r. My hat circumference is 22.5, so 22.5 equals 2 pi r, and then we can solve for r. Now we know that for the brim piece we need to cut a circle with a donut hole that has a radius of 3.58 inches. But we aren't done yet. If you were to unmold this cone shape into a flat piece, you would discover that it is a piece, or a sector, of an even larger circle. To draft this piece, we need to find the radius of this circle. Referring back to our diagram, the radius of this circle happens to be equal to the slant height, or L, of our cone. We already know H and R, So we can use the Pythagorean theorem to solve for L, which in our case we can express that as r squared plus h squared equals L squared. Solving for that tells us that we need to cut a large circle with a radius of 10.62 inches. Finally, to cut our pizza wedge, or our circular sector, we need one more piece of information, and that's the angle to cut it at to arrive at the correct circumference. To find that, we simply need to find the ratio of the smaller circle's diameter to the larger circle's diameter, and then multiply by 360 degrees. Also, to quote Doc Brown, please forgive the crudeness of this diagram in my book of my sketchbook. It's not to scale. Here's a much better diagram that is to scale. So solving for that gave me an angle of about 121 degrees. Finally, to find the size of the circle we want to cut our brim, we just need to add our desired brim width to our smaller radius r. So that's not too complicated. Now we have all the information we need to draft this custom witch hat. See? Wasn't that easy? And you can use those 3 formulas to make a witch hat of virtually any size, whether it's a tiny doll hat or a humongous hat. If it's physically possible, you can make it. Anyway, enough geeking out over math. Let's make the hat already. To start, I need to make a paper pattern. To cut my cone piece, I'm starting with a single point. From this point, I drew a line equal to the radius I calculated earlier, 10.62 inches. The final wedge shape should have an angle equal to the one I calculated earlier. If you've done this correctly, the length of the arc should be equal to your desired hat circumference. This gives you your net pattern piece. Remember how earlier I said that the math that we did not include seam allowances? That was because I was calculating the net pattern, or in other words, the finished hat size excluding the seam allowance. Now we're going to add our seam allowance back. I like to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I'll simply draw a 1/2 inch border around the net pattern piece. The procedure for drafting the brim piece is pretty similar, except we are drawing 2 full concentric circles. Like before, this is a net pattern, so we'll need to add a 1/2 inch seam allowance to the outer circumference and a 1/2 inch to the inner donut hole. If you've calculated and cut everything accurately, your net pattern pieces should fit together perfectly. Now that you have your pattern cut, it's a good time to test the fit of your pattern before you start cutting into your nice fabric. Speaking of, I'm using a black cotton velveteen for this project, which was about $13 a yard, so kinda pricey. For the lining, I picked up some cute cotton Halloween prints. This part is going to be inside the cone, so it isn't really going to show, but I thought it would be a fun little surprise if anyone looks inside. And just to be sure, and cause I'm still a little paranoid about this, I went an extra step and made a mock-up out of muslin and cheap scrap fabric. It was extremely stupid looking, but the fit was good, so we can move on. Launder your fabric, people. I know it's really annoying to add an extra step, but it does make a huge difference when you are working with cotton, so don't skip this, especially if you plan on ever washing it. After it's washed, the lining fabric gets a quick press. The velveteen can't be pressed the ordinary way without crushing the pile, so I carefully draped the fabric to prevent any creases from forming. I cut one cone out of the velveteen, one cone out of the lining fabric, and two brim pieces out of the velveteen. On the inner donut hole of the brim, clip 4 small notches at 0, 90, 180, and 270 degrees. Make sure that these notches do not exceed your seam allowance. This is going to help you ease the cone piece into the brim piece later. I wanted my hat to have a lot of structure and be moldable, so I also cut one cone piece and one brim piece out of some interfacing, and then it was time to assemble. The interfacing I bought is fusible, so I ironed the cone interfacing to the lining fabric. Since both brim pieces are velveteen and ironing it on would crush the pile, I tacked the interfacing down with large stitches in a contrasting thread color. That way I can easily see it to remove it later after the hat is fully assembled. I stitched each cone piece right sides together, and then slid the lining cone into the outer cone. I stitched the two brim pieces together along the outer edge, again right sides together. To give the brim a crisper edge, I carefully pressed the seam with a wool dryer ball. The idea is to kind of gently train the fabric to hold its shape without crushing the pile. So low heat, light pressure, and an extremely delicate touch. And then I turned the brim right side out. On my hat, I also inserted a piece of wire into the brim so that I can shape the hat later. You know, the whole strategically dipped below one eye thing. Next, I sewed the cone into the brim. This part is a little bit tricky on the machine since you have to sew around a really tight circle. So you may want to stay stitch the two pieces together by hand and then machine stitch for a little added security. It looks great now, and you could leave it as it is if that's all the time you had. But just to tidy things up on the inside, I made some bias tape out of the leftover lining fabric, and I stitched it onto the raw edge. After that, you can decorate as you see fit. I'm going for a cute 90s witch look, so I made bows for my hat. All that's left now is to get dressed and test out my powers. I'm not a big makeup person anymore, mostly because I've grown kinda lazy about it, but for you guys, I'll give it a go, if my reflection will hold still for a change. She's kinda got an attitude. Then again, she is trapped in a piece of glass. In all seriousness, this red is giving me more Taylor Swift vibes than Y2K vibes, so sorry evil mirror twin, but I think clear lip gloss wins today. Revelare. Well, anyway, friends, that's how it's done. I hope this video inspired you to make your own bespoke witch hat for you and your familiars, or any other witch you know. Now get out there and put the craft back in witchcraft. And I foresee I will see you all back here again very soon for more painting, crafting, and creating. Thanks for watching. Bye, witches.